He was the man who taught the world that everything begins with desire. But what happens when desire begins to disappear? This isn't just a story about Freud, it's about every man who has ever looked at his own reflection and wondered, am I still the man I used to be? If you've ever felt that quiet fear, stay with me. This one's for you. They say Freud spent his life trying to understand what made men tremble with desire, with fear, with shame. But in the end, what haunted him wasn't a patient, it was his own body. The once commanding voice of psychoanalysis found itself quieter, frailer, and for the first time interrupted by something he couldn't explain away his own silence when desire didn't come. This isn't a story about Freud the thinker, this is about Freud the man, aging uncertain and slowly unraveling in the very space he once thought he could control. He was 74 when he first noticed it. Not a complete absence, not a disappearance, but a soft fading. Like an actor who forgets his lines mid-scene, something within him no longer responded the way it used to. A touch that once awakened something primal now felt clinical, detached. The body, once a willing co-conspirator, had become hesitant, resistant. And for the father of psychoanalysis, that hesitation became its own form of betrayal. Freud had written tomes on repression, on the libido, on the unconscious currents that drive us to seek pleasure. He'd taught generations of doctors that the body was never just a machine, it was a messenger, a battleground between instinct and inhibition. But what happens when the battle turns inward, when the theorist becomes the specimen? At night, he would lie beside his wife Martha, their bodies no longer pressed together in the way they had once been in youth. She had always been tender, quiet in her affections, faithful in her routines, and for many years that had been enough. But lately something had stirred strangely, not in the body but in the mind. A longing not just for contact, but for proof that he was still a man who could want. And more than that, still a man who could be wanted. The urge to be touched had not vanished, but when her fingers brushed against his hand under the blanket, nothing happened. No surge, no tension, just a blankness, a deep silence, and that silence frightened him. Not because he missed the act itself, he'd long accepted that passion in the physical sense was no longer nightly business. What unnerved him was the loss of connection between what he imagined and what his body could deliver. The mind had always been his kingdom, but now even the king was disobeyed by his soldiers. He tried to analyze it. Of course he did. He returned to his own writings, reviewed his early work on the sexual development of the ego, his lectures on neurosis and desire. He reread case studies trying to recall what he once told younger men in similar distress. Was it fear-suppressed guilt? Had something unresolved in childhood returned to haunt the old man? But this wasn't about guilt. It wasn't about repression. This wasn't theory, it was biology. Time. The slow, irrevocable dimming of something that had once burned too brightly. Still, there was shame. Of course there was. Quiet, civilized shame that settled in the bones of a man raised in the 19th century, even one who had spent his life trying to break the taboos around sex and body and longing. He didn't dare speak of it to his closest students. Not Jung, not Adler, not even his own disciples who whispered his teachings like gospel. Because what kind of man, what kind of legend admits that he can no longer feel what he once explained with such certainty? One night, unable to sleep, he stood at the mirror and looked at himself, fully naked, pale, older than he remembered being. His hands still trembled a little, from the morphine he was taking for the jaw cancer that would eventually kill him. His eyes, once sharp, now clouded at the edges. He stared not with judgment, but with a strange kind of mourning. Not just for youth or virility, but for the illusion that he'd ever been in control. He ran his fingers along his chest, once solid, now softer. He remembered the girl he loved when he was 17, how her voice had made him hard without touching. He remembered the awkwardness of their first night together, how his hands had trembled, not with fear but with wanting. That fire, that mystery, where had it gone? He felt the absence like a ghost in the room, like something sacred had slipped away quietly without ceremony. He began to wonder whether all men came to this quiet edge, where the body no longer obeys the mind's desire, where arousal becomes memory rather than sensation. He had spent a lifetime naming things, id ego libido death drive. But what do you name the fading of desire? What Latin root could explain the soft creeping grief of no longer being wanted? Not by others, but by your own body. It wasn't just about sex, it was about disappearance. For decades, Freud had been at the center of intellectual circles, and writing feverishly, teaching, theorizing, dissecting the human soul with the sharp edge of language. But now he often found himself falling silent in mid-sentence. His thoughts still swirled, but his voice, much like his body, could no longer follow with the same force. He began to withdraw, not out of bitterness, but a quiet resignation. Conversations that once thrilled him now left him exhausted. And in the silence something old resurfaced, not theory, not memory, but a soft, aching need. A longing not for performance, but for intimacy, the kind without ambition, without goals, just touch for the sake of being real. There was a moment unplanned one quiet afternoon. Martha entered his study, bringing him tea, her presence light and unobtrusive as always. She didn't expect anything from him. She never did. But as she placed the cup beside his chair, their fingers touched briefly, and for a moment, just a breath, he wished she would stay. Sit beside him, press her hand on his shoulder, rest her head where it used to fit, on his chest so many years ago. But he didn't ask. He nodded, said thank you, and let her return to the garden. He felt too much shame to admit that what he missed wasn't the act of sex, but the sense of being needed physically, emotionally, completely. The rituals of touch, the unspoken electricity between two people who had shared years, births, deaths, dinners, arguments, and silence. He remembered patience men, mostly who confessed to similar losses, but couldn't find the words. They would talk about fatigue or stress, never saying directly that they feared becoming less of a man. Freud had once smiled at that notion, dismissing it as a cultural construct. But now, older and quieter, he began to understand. Manhood wasn't about function, it was about recognition, to be seen still as someone desirable. Not powerful, not brilliant, just wanted. He once believed desire was rooted in unresolved trauma, but now he wondered what if it was something softer? What if desire wasn't always a symptom to be interpreted, but a prayer from the body? A need to feel close, to merge, to matter. There were days he'd touch the edges of those thoughts, and then retreat, afraid to admit how much he missed being touched with intention. In younger years, he might have turned to analysis, to deconstruct the feeling, give it form, place it on the couch, and ask it to speak. But now he simply let it pass like weather. He noticed the patterns, how the mind would remember, arousal in vivid detail. Scent taste the curve of a shoulder, but the body wouldn't respond. Not with urgency, not with fire. Just a gentle echo of something that used to be. And yet some nights, while half asleep, he'd feel something stir. Not arousal exactly, but a kind of warmth, an inner flicker. And it wasn't about sex, it was about closeness. He would dream of lying beside someone, not in passion but in peace, just breathing in rhythm, flesh to flesh. That he realized is what he missed the most, not the fire but the contact, not conquest, not climax, but being held. As if in that moment the mind could stop running, the world could stop asking, the body could simply exist, tired, aging, imperfect, and still be enough. He never wrote those thoughts down, not in his notebooks, not in his letters, but they lived inside him quietly, like a confession even he wasn't ready to analyze. As the months passed, Freud found himself thinking less about desire in the clinical sense and more in the human sense. Not libido, not eros, but longing, the quieter, gentler kind that came at dusk when the mind slowed down and the distractions faded. He began to realize that this was the side of aging no one really wrote about. Not in textbooks, not in theories, not even in poetry. The silent erosion of touch. It wasn't just the loss of sexual function that unsettled him. It was how quietly it slipped away, how unceremoniously it exited. There was no fanfare, no moment of finality, just a slow, cumulative noticing. A soft disconnection between want and response memory and sensation. He remembered once theorizing that sexuality was at the root of every dream, every neurosis, every twitch of the unconscious. But now he no longer cared about dreams or symbols. He cared about the man sitting in his own chair, wondering whether he was still fully alive. Not intellectually, not professionally, but physically, sensually. Some part of him still believed that connection was possible, that even in this stage of life, he could experience closeness, not through penetration or climax, but through stillness, through mutual presence. In his early work, he'd argued that civilization demanded the repression of desire, that men were forced to tuck away their urges in order to build societies. But now, older and freer from society's demands, he wondered if that repression had seeped too deep. What had he buried so long ago that it now refused to surface? And then he thought of his patients again, especially the older men, the ones who stumbled through explanations, unable to name what they feared, that they were no longer desirable, that they no longer had the right to want, that they had been quietly exiled from the world of touch and longing. They had spoken in code, "I don't sleep well anymore. I'm just not myself these days. She doesn't look at me the same. I think I'm just tired." And he, the doctor, had nodded, had listened, had probed. But he had not understood. Not until now. Not until he, too, looked at his own reflection and asked, "Do I still matter as a man if I am no longer wanted as one?" That question haunted him, not because he feared the answer, but because he now realized how deeply the question itself lived inside every man. In his final letters to colleagues, he rarely mentioned these thoughts. He focused on his work, on his illness, on his legacy. But in his personal notebook kept separate from his clinical writings, there were short, unsentenced phrases. One simply read, "What becomes of longing when the body forgets?" Another, "The body does not betray, it simply retires. But the mind still waits by the door." These weren't theories, they were whispers, fragments, the voice of a man, still trying to feel human in the midst of decline. One rainy morning, Freud sat beside the window, his body wrapped in a heavy coat even in summer. His bones ached, his jaw deformed from surgeries pulsed with pain. But his mind wandered elsewhere, back to a day long ago, when Martha had surprised him with a kiss behind his ear. It had been so gentle, so unexpected. He remembered how it had sent a current through him, straight to the center of his chest. He didn't remember what came after that moment, only the moment itself, the spark, the reminder that someone had seen him fully. And for the first time in weeks, he smiled. Not because the memory was erotic, but because it was alive. It made him feel even now. That's what he began to understand. In these final months, sexuality isn't about age function or expectation. It's about presence, about being met, about feeling one's body stir not in performance, but in response to being truly seen. He would never again write theories on desire. He would leave that to others. But he knew something now that his earlier self did not. That in the end, when the body slows, when touch fades, when heat softens into breath, what remains is this: the need to be known, the wish to be close, and the quiet, enduring hope that even if the body can no longer rise to meet the world, the soul still can. So maybe this wasn't Freud's final theory. Maybe it was his final confession, that no matter how much we understand the mind, we still live inside bodies that age, falter, and sometimes forget how to feel. And even then, we still long, not just for sex or sensation, but for closeness, for contact, for proof that we are not fading quietly into the corners of our lives. He spent his life interpreting dreams, decoding symbols, naming things that others were too afraid to speak of. But in the end, maybe what mattered wasn't the analysis, but the honesty. That even the great Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, feared being unseen, untouched, and unremembered. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt that quiet ache, that moment where the mind wants but the body doesn't follow, if you've ever wondered whether desire disappears with age or just transforms into something more tender, more patient, more rooted in presence, then let this be your permission. You are not broken. You are not alone. You are still a man. Not because of what your body can or cannot do, but because you still feel, still yearn, still care. That's what makes you alive. And if no one's told you this lately, you are still worthy of touch, of closeness, of being known. Even now, especially now. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of something you've quietly carried, please let us know in the comments. And if you'd like to keep exploring these quiet, honest moments together, subscribe to this channel. There are many more stories ahead, gentle, truthful, and just for you. Thank you for listening. Until next time, be kind to your mind, and even kinder to your body.